Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday, April 28th, 2026. It's just after 2:30 in the afternoon, and we are taking up another bill, S-223, relating to water quality of the waters of Vermont. So we have Grady from Ledge Council, and we have Chair Sheldon from House Environment, and we have Chris Root from Joint Fiscal. So I think we've got everybody. Mike, we'll start with you.
Good afternoon. This is Michael Grady with Legislative Council. As I think you all know, water quality issues have been one of the paramount environmental issues that the state has been looking at over the past 15 to 20 years. And you've definitely addressed them in the General Assembly and A&R, definitely addressed some of them, like the Lake Champlain PMDL, statewide water quality funding, like basin plans and bringing them up to speed and updating them on the appropriate schedule. So a lot of things have been done, but there are still several questions or issues that remain depending on your point of view. And this bill would establish a committee to look at 3/4 of those issues and recommend to you how to address them either through legislation or policy. And so those 3/4 issues can get a little wonky, but effectively I can try to summarize them for you quickly. One relates to the classification of waters. States are required by the Clean Water Act to have water quality standards and to manage their waters, to maintain those standards and to maintain the quality of those waters. And in order to do that, most states go out and classify their waters a certain type because depending on where the water is, depending on its use, some waters are higher quality than other waters. And Vermont did that by statute. It went out and created 4 classifications, well, existing 4 classifications of water, and set a default. It said the default is B. You know, everyone starts at B, but if you can show that you're meeting higher quality, if your uses are being supported, certain uses are being supported at a higher level in a water, then it can be reclassified. And it could be reclassified as A or A1 or A2. And when it's reclassified, it has to be managed to maintain that, and which means it has to be subject to higher criteria or levels of regulation. Well, reclassification happens by rule, and the agency has gone out and identified multiple waters that should no longer be B, but should be reclassified as A, but they are not reclassifying those waters. And so the first issue to look at is on, it's kind of page 3, line 1 through 5, and lines 12 through 16. The agency, this working group, is going to go out and develop an inventory of the waters of the state with the existing classification for each water, and include candidate high quality waters with water quality data that meet or exceed the minimum criteria. That means identify the waters that and their classifications and identify those that exceed those the current classifications that should be able to go higher. And then on page 3, lines 12 through 16, identify and evaluate the statutory and regulatory framework for governing Class A waters, including what modifications are needed to facilitate reclassification of eligible waters to adequately protect and support designated and existing uses. So effectively, 1/2 issues: identify what the classifications of waters are, identify those waters that should be classified as higher, and then identify how to do that and what are the regulatory obstacles that are preventing A&R from doing that today.
So A&Rs, from my time over there, have a list of waters and classifications. So you're suggesting that A&R
They still do.
still do.
It's fairly long.
You're suggesting that they're intentionally not classifying things higher?
I don't want to speak to any intent. I just know that they aren't.
So then the next question is, when you say, what's the level of testing or knowledge that would be required? You can't go out and take one sample and say, oh, this one should be classified at this level. Are there any criteria? Are you hoping that these folks, this doesn't look like a group of people necessarily that would know all the details of things? How are you going to know whether or not the proper sampling has been done to properly identify something?
Well, there's two ongoing monitoring and assessment programs that the state has to do on a regular basis under the Federal Clean Water Act. The first is every 2 years, they're supposed to report on the status of the water quality of all waters of the state. And basically I'm sure it's a report you've seen before, Rep. LaRoche, and I know you've seen it before. But there's also a requirement that they go out and assess what waters are impaired and what they're impaired for, and that's every 3 years. And in order to do both of those programs, they do have to do monitoring. And so there are DEC staff that do the monitoring. They also rely on a kind of a volunteer monitoring program as well. But there is ongoing monitoring subject to those two different assessment methods under the Federal Clean Water Act.
I'm just suggesting you could go out there one day and it may be beautiful. You go out there on a different kind of day and this could be severely impaired.
Sure, and so the impairment assessment, they don't just go out and do one sample, because impairments can depend on season. It can depend on flow. It can depend on a lot of different stressors, and so they do multiple sampling. But if they've already done the sampling and they've already identified certain waters as meeting the higher water quality criteria, why aren't they reclassifying?
Question that maybe they could answer. And I'm quibbling over the amount of work that would be necessary in order to go far beyond what DEC's already got. And then we have Fish and Wildlife too, and no mention of Fish and Wildlife and the uses of those waters in terms of, what are the economic.
Well, that's partly, and it relates to one of the second issues. So that
Let's finish up that.
study group's going to look at.
Divergent as usual. Go ahead.
So another part of the Federal Clean Water Act is once you have a water that's meeting a certain water quality, the state has to manage it to maintain that water quality, and that you can't let it degrade. And so that's called the anti-degradation policy. And every state needs to have an anti-degradation policy, and every state has to have an implementation method for anti-degradation. Vermont has an anti-degradation policy. It's in the Vermont Water Quality Standards rules. And it basically says that waters need to be managed to maintain their quality. And if it's a Class A water, you do this. If it's a Class A B water, you do this, etc. But it doesn't necessarily how you apply that, how you implement that when there's a project, an activity, a proposal for a discharge. That is supposed to be dealt with. Your statute says that A&R was supposed to adopt an anti-degradation implementation rule to set forth how to implement the anti-degradation policy. The agency did not do that, and they have not done that for a long time. Instead, they issued a procedure, and as most of you know, procedures are supposed to govern the internal aspects of an agency, not necessarily general application to the public, unless you say they can use a procedure for general application, because you do that in Rep. LaRoche, you know that for migratory bird hunting, etc. But they haven't adopted the rules, so they're not complying with the statute. They only have a procedure. It's not very clear how they're being how they're implementing that procedure. And so the second thing that this group is looking at is on page 3, lines 6 through 11, the state's obligation under the Clean Water Act with respect to adoption of an anti-degradation rule to implement the state's anti-degradation policy under the water quality standards, including an evaluation of state and federal statutory and regulatory requirements and identification of any legal, administrative, policy, or practical barriers to full compliance. So why are they not doing an implementation rule as required by statute? I will note that across the country, the 50 states, it's kind of half and half. Most states do it by rule or do it through a procedure under a rule or a policy or guidance under a rule. But there are some states that just have guidance documents on how to do implementation. If that's what you want to do, I think that's an option for you to do. But your statute currently says they have to adopt an anti-degradation implementation rule, and they haven't done that.
It seems, as you know, I'm a fishery biologist. I've spent thousands and thousands of hours on streams. I took 2 flights looking at all the north end of Lake Champlain, Missisquoi Bay, up the Missisquoi River, up Trout River, all the way to the border on those streams. After that bad storm event we had some years ago where the lake was really flooded. And I videoed, took pictures the whole way. You can see where the degradation is coming from. It doesn't take more studies. All it takes is some action. You go find muddy water after a thunderstorm, and it doesn't take too long to walk upstream to find where it comes from. Well, then that's just one thing, but nobody does it that way. And if you fix that problem, you wouldn't have to cause huge trouble to the farmers and the other landowners either. Cost that much, but you have to take action. And I'm just concerned that we're always studying things and we don't take the actions going to be efficient. When I was in the agency, I went out and I took videos of everything that's going on. And I gave a presentation to our core team at that time showing where all the problems were and what needed to be fixed.
But that's what this group is going to do, right? They're going to look at why anti-deg hasn't been implemented the way that the statute requires, how to provide action in response to areas where there is identified degradation. And then it's going to propose to you, the General Assembly, how to address that. And so, and it could, maybe it says, address it through letting A&R issue a policy or guidance instead of an anti-deg rule. But that's what they're going to look at, how to do anti-deg implementation.
Continue.
And so the fourth major thing to look at is when you classify waters in the state, you don't classify them based on what kind of waters they are. Like, is it a river? Is it a stream? Is it a pond? You classify them on what uses are supported by that water. There's debate about whether or not certain waters, such as lakes, should have different classifications because of the nature of those lakes. They are deeper, they're used more for recreation. They have, in many instances, a greater variety of aquatic biota and aquatic habitat. And some of those lakes are of higher classification than others. And do you want to manage those lakes based on lake quality and not just water quality? And some states do that, Maine, Minnesota, some of the other Midwest states. They manage not on what uses the water is supporting, they manage first on what kind of water it is and then what it does. And so that's the fourth thing that the group would look at. It's whether the existing water classification in the state and related statutory and regulatory framework protect the ecological integrity of the state's lakes and ponds and adequately address the current and potential threats to water quality of lakes and ponds. So that is the fourth thing that the group would be reporting on. Now, the group is is a pretty large group. There's 12 members, 2 House, 2 Senate, Secretary of Natural Resources or her designee, a DEC water quality scientist appointed by the Secretary, 2 persons representing businesses that have interaction with water quality permitting, 1 appointed by the Speaker, 1 appointed by the Committee on Committees, 2 environmental advocates, 1 appointed by the Speaker, 1 appointed by the Committee on Committees, a person representing Federation of Lakes and Ponds appointed by the Governor, and a person representing the Green Mountain Water Environment Association appointed by the Speaker of the House. So we just looked at the things, the powers that the group has and what they are to address on page 3. They recommend legislative and policy amendments to you at top of page 4, line 1, 3. They have the assistance, administrative, technical, and legal assistance of A&R, and then the legal and drafting assistance of Ledge Counsel. Page 4, line 7, they report to you December 15, 2026, with its findings and recommendations. Secretary of Natural Resources calls the first meeting. The group elects its chair. Study group ceases to exist February 15, 2027. There is a provision in here for compensation of legislative members for 8 meetings and compensation of non-legislative members for 8 meetings. And then there's a little bit of a different kind of a variation to your contingency funding. As you all know, when you are seeing something for the first time, we've had these contingency clauses that says if it's not funded, then the agency is not required to implement it. This says if the compensation is not funded, the compensation is not required to be paid, but the group still goes forward.
Sounds like Homeland Security. I think that's what the one that we're talking about, maybe doing an amendment and just taking that out. We're going to hear from Joint Fiscal Office about that. It may actually end up being easier because we can just take care of it. We don't have to worry about it. Yeah, right.
So it bothers me that we don't have the fishery. Our fishery volunteers are everywhere. And they're not on there. Also bothers me that we got environmental groups, 2 environmental groups, but no fish group. I mean, we've got, we used to have a walleye association, have various trout unlimited, and we have various fishery type groups on there. You thoughts?
Well, the group has the assistance, legal and technical, of the agency as a whole, not just DEC. So the agency includes Department of Fish and Wildlife. So Sean or whomever can be asked to present to the group and provide information and support. I think although there's no explicit reference to fisheries and the work that they do, the group can engage with the agency.
The perspective of DEC water quality people is quite different than the perspective of the knowledge.
I'm very well aware.
Yeah, go ahead, Amy, come on up and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more. And then Mike, I've got you for next.
Representative Amy Sheldon Middlebury. I guess just to address a couple of things that Representative LaRoche has brought up. Well, actually, to put it also in a little context is that this is in response to a few points of interest or kind of things that keep coming up. I know Senator Bongart's introduced this bill. He's very much concerned about the degradation of water quality in our lakes. And lake homeowners have also reached out to us pretty consistently asking us to address this issue. And the issue is that they have Class A waters already. And I guess what I want to say is, and maybe we're not reinventing, we're not doing a new inventory. We're bringing the information that already exists together for this report. It's not, no one's going out to collect new field data. We're using what the agency already has, which is a pretty extensive list of Class A candidates, which already, is my understanding, have to meet anti-degradation policy. It's not rule, it's policy. It's a guidance document.
Right.
So it's first of all, it's lack transparency. So it's not that this work isn't happening when projects come forward, but the question is like, how is it happening? It is statutorily required. And then the issue of should we be helping or doing something different for our lakes? Should they be separate from other bodies of water like the rivers is an important piece of what we're focusing on here. And is that the reason I came up? Did I lose
That, and there were members of Fish and Wildlife not on the
Oh, well, they're part of the classification. I mean, they must be like, so that we're not doing new reclassifications. The waters of the state of Vermont, as legislative council already said, have a regular cycle of being evaluated for what their designation is.
I might ask, but I'm not sure that the fishery biologists are always involved.
I know.
DEC has the authority to do that, and they regularly don't consult necessarily across lines there.
That may be an executive branch issue rather than a legislative branch issue. And I would suggest that I know that benthic macroinvertebrates are a very key indicator of water quality health, and that scientists from both probably are monitoring them. So I would be surprised if they're not sharing.
Thank you. Stay there, we may have more questions. Mike, there's another section we'll talk about section 2 in the contingency when Chris Roop comes up, but why don't we go on to the.
Sure. On page 5, line 15, there's a requirement that A&R submit to you, the General Assembly, a report recommending whether to establish a program to certify wetlands professionals for purposes of identifying and delineating wetlands boundaries. Right now, if you hire someone to go out and identify the boundaries of your wetlands to identify whether wetlands exist on your property, that person doesn't necessarily have to have a minimum required professional expertise. So the report will address the benefits and disadvantages of a wetland professional certification program, whether it accelerates permitting, reduces the amount of wetland services available, increases the cost of wetland services, or delays permitting, discuss how the wetlands professional certification program could impact the liability of wetlands professionals, including whether certification would subject professionals to increased risk of liability or increased liability insurance requirements. And then if the secretary does recommend establishment of the program, description of the proposed program, the proposed requirements for certification, the description of the activities that the professional will be authorized to conduct as part of certification, and what benefit, if any, services from a certified wetlands professional would provide to customers or in a regulatory proceeding. And then in developing that report, they are going to consult with wetlands professionals who currently conduct wetlands delineations and other persons with knowledge of wetlands permitting and services provided by wetlands professionals. This concept has been discussed a few times over the past couple of years, and this really just puts structure around what you want to see as a recommendation from the agency about how it would work, what the benefits are, both to the professional and to the regulated community, and what the effectively what the liabilities or the negatives are to both the professional and the regulated entity.
Did not.
Okay.
I was just smiling. You know,
Okay,
like,
that's just dandy. I don't want to, I don't always look in that direction.
No.
Great, so we're just asking the secretary and folks to look into this and give us some.
I mean, if you were going to go to a full-fledged certification process like the OPR process, you're going to need a lot more detail, like
Absolutely.
Who's going to be on the board, what the
Yeah.
education requirements are, what the certificate, how often do they need to be recertified, things like that. Like the way that OPR sets up each of their programs, you would need that kind of.
But this is a good first step to see if we even need to take all those other steps.
And this was part of some amendments brought to us by the administration that they were ready, that they thought kind of to go with this. And we thought we actually need more information before we could, because we took testimony that could take a lot of time and money to get certified and
Yeah.
kind of like step back, what's the problem we're trying to solve? There are only 25 wetlands ecologists right now doing delineations on the A&R list. And so you transition to a program like this, and all of a sudden, those folks aren't even, I mean, unless they got grandfathered in somehow, they wouldn't necessarily even be on that list, so. Seemed like a good
Start
step.
with step one, not step three. Great. Any other questions for, Sheldon or Parks Council at the moment? Chris?
So I'd like to be really brief now.
Okay.
The bill, the issues around this are obviously very complicated. The bill, a little less so. It's essentially creating a study group and requiring a report. So it is here because of per diem and expense reimbursement for the members of the group. Based on our methodology, we assume that it costs up to $15,000 for the General Assembly budget, with the standard caveats that all of you are familiar with, you know, meeting frequency, how far somebody's gonna drive, so on and so forth. The one thing I wanted to flag for the committee is, you know, section 2 has that contingent provision on funding where the per diem and expense reimbursement are contingent on a specific appropriation being made for this. It is April 28th, where we are in the legislative process, and based on where we think the bills with legislative study groups and things like that are coming out. I checked with our finance manager, Scott Moore. He thinks the General Assembly budget can absorb the cost of this. There is not a specific appropriation out of our budget just for this. So should this committee agree to move forward on the bill and that the members of the working group should be entitled to this compensation, I would recommend that you all might want to consider amending section 2 just to remove it.
Moving in, yeah,
Because I think it would be clearer about it.
Yeah. okay. People good with that idea? Fair Sheldon, you're okay with that?
Yes.
They forgot the money. And here's like, we finally got this up ahead of time, knowing that we're always gonna ask, and having you do an amendment to put one in, and you put it in, and now we're gonna take it out.
It's great. I'd rather have the funding.
I know,
It was a bit of a unusual discussion in Senate appropriations when they added that clause, and so.
yeah, because even if we don't pay you, you have to do the work anyway. It sounds like that's what the clause said. Okay, so can you give us an amendment in the next couple minutes to? That would be great, and then we can vote on that and vote on the bill as amended.
Right.
And we'll get that out today.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all. And we have Pat coming back in the next 15 minutes to talk, to give us the fiscal note on the other bill that we just did. And so we can vote both of these out. This one would be Trevor's. First one is Tom.